Welcome to the We Are More podcast. My name is Alyssa.
And my name is Bree. We're two sisters passionate about all things faith and feminism.
We believe that Jesus trusted, respected, and encouraged women to teach and preach his word. And apparently that's controversial.
Get comfy.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to episode 8.
Is it?
We've got to
Yes.
stop making this joke.
It's not a joke. I think it is episode 8, but it's part 2.
Yes.
The continuation. Dreams come true.
I was literally about to say that.
Submission part 2. Dreams come true.
Things get better from here. Unknown.
Maybe this part will be less rage.
Maybe.
I doubt it.
Probably not. So last week we talked about the big S.
Not Stacy.
No. We talked about submission, which is one that we have been ready to kind of get into for a while.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough topic.
It's tough, and yet it's like the most important thing.
It's the most important, and I think it's so misunderstood amongst the Christian community because a lot of people believe in it but don't live it.
Right. Well, we've talked about that before with our parents, where they would have preached it, like they would have said, yeah, this is what you're supposed to do as a Christian couple, Christian woman, but really, like, we never saw... Our mom was not any sort of submissive wife.
Mom was just as much of a leader as Dad was.
Right.
And I think that is kind of what shaped you and I into who we are today. We're strong, confident ladies.
She'll like to hear that.
You're welcome, Mom.
Yeah, I mean, because we saw an example of that. But at the same time, because it was preached to us in our home and at church, like, not just from Mom and Dad.
Yeah, for sure.
From most of the female influences in our lives. And a lot of the male influences in our lives, too. I think, at least for me, that's what shaped how I approached relationships and marriage. In the beginning, anyway, before I kind of started to branch off on my own.
Yeah.
So last week was a little bit of a downer.
Because we just were full of, as Taylor Swift would say, female rage.
The musical.
She's trying to trademark that.
She should. That's pretty good. If she does, though, we might have to cut that part out.
Sorry, Taylor. I'm sure she's listening.
I'm sure she is. So we talked through a little bit, kind of the main complementarian points, I think.
For arguments that submission was pre-fall.
Right. So that submission started, like when God planned out the human race, that he planned it with female submission in the perfect order of things.
Right.
And really I really think in order for the whole argument of wives should submit to their husbands in everything all the time only works if it did precede the fall. So again, churchy terms. But if it happened before
The first
sin entered the world, yeah. So we just kind of went through a lot of the main arguments. We worked through a specific article, but it addressed all of the main things that we've heard, at least, right?
Yeah.
So today we're going to go from the opposite perspective. Frankly, at this point, I'm not sure if this is a 2-parter episode or a 3-parter episode.
I think it's an ongoing conversation. So, like, these will be the two, first introductions to the topic maybe on the podcast. But I think it's a topic that is going to span the lifetime of you and I talking about this nonsense.
I think it's going to span our lifetimes.
It may.
And anyone who chooses to interact with us.
Yeah. Sorry.
Prepare yourselves. Anyone who
We're
knows
obnoxious.
us. So one of the, I guess, bloggers that I follow on Facebook, I'm actually not sure which one it was. I will have to look that up and maybe post it on the Insta.
If you're not following us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook,
YouTube.
I was gonna say, like, carrier pigeon, smoke signal. You should.
Yeah, you should definitely follow us on Carrier Pigeon. We're great at that.
Very occasionally we post something very funny. Or inspirational.
Mostly it's funny. But yeah, any of those we are more of a .podcast, right? And then TikTok is...
It's confusing. I'm sure if you looked up, like, We Are More Podcast, we'd pop up, but it's like we.more... Nope. I did that. This is the second time
I think it is.
We.R.more 4.
Okay.
I think it's technically the name.
Okay. And Brie posts some good stuff over there, so definitely check it out. We post previews there a lot, so that's always fun. You can kind of see what insanity we're about to say before you jump in.
Or you could see our faces. Our beautiful, beautiful faces.
They're so beautiful.
Mostly my face on TikTok.
I haven't figured TikTok out yet.
I'm a little vain.
Yeah, well, we know that. They've been listening. If you haven't been listening, go back and you can see how vain Brie is.
I think we both are.
I don't know what you're talking about. I am humble as much as you possibly could be.
God hears your lies, and he will smite you.
So, today, anyway, I feel like every time I try and get us back on track, I say, so
today...
I think you should try. Get us back on track, Brie.
If I were a train, what would I do? So today, we're going to go over a different article that argues that submission was not God's perfect design for humanity. Right?
That women specifically submitting to their husbands wasn't God's perfect plan.
Well, there you go.
Because I think, when we talk, the word submission is a rough one in general. It just doesn't come across very well. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the section in Ephesians that we're about to go through, you can see that before God tells women to submit to their husbands, he tells couples to submit to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where you really can see, for lack of a better phrase, God's perfect plan for humanity is to both submit to one another. Mm-hmm. And we've there's a lot to this, and we'll get into it, but we've put like a paragraph break in there between submit to one another and then the section about God's instructions to women and God's instructions to men. But the paragraph break was not there before.
Right. There's something that we added in.
Yeah, translators added it. And you have to ask...
you and I.
That's true. But you have to ask the question, like, what was the motivation behind adding a paragraph break there? Adding a chapter break there? Mm-hmm. Because all of the chapters and the verse numbers and things like that, we put in. Mm-hmm. Again, not you and I. I don't think I'm quite that educated.
I'm not. I was an art major.
But there's going to be certain motivations there.
Right.
And depending on who is translating, you're going to get different biases. Mm-hmm. Biases?
Again, I was an art major. You were the English major.
Sorry, I still don't know. All right. So this article, I want to give you the website name, but again, I don't know how to say her name.
It looks like Marge.
It's Marge, but then I think it's Maushko is what I'm going to go with.
Okay.
We can link it. The title of it is The Chiastic Structure of Ephesians 5:22 to 23. Or to 33, I'm sorry.
About a mouthful. Holy cow.
It is quite. But essentially, she is talking about Ephesians 5, which is, I think they call them the household codes.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's essentially like Paul, because it wasn't Jesus talking here, it's Paul talking here to the Ephesian church, and he's telling husbands and wives what they should be doing. Now, preface all of that by saying husbands and wives in Roman society. So this is the segment where Paul is telling husbands and wives how they should behave towards one another, what God's plan is for them, and what he wants from them. However, Paul is talking to people in the Roman world, to people in first century Roman societies, which again are very patriarchal. There are actual laws telling women you better do what your husband says, or literal death penalty.
Right.
So keep that in mind. So I'm going to read this segment here. So this is Ephesians 5:22 through 33. And so this does cut out the part where it says to submit to one another. But it's important to read it like this in the context of her blog. Mm-hmm. Because she's talking about something called chiastic structure, which is super interesting. I had not heard about this before. And again, I was an English major, so maybe I just failed that class. Marge says that Paul in this section is using a common literary device that can be found in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, and that he uses it several times throughout his writing.
Think haiku.
Yeah. And this, to me, informs a lot of why Paul seems confusing.
I'm gonna be honest. Paul is a confusing man.
Yeah. But I think a big part of it is what she's saying here is Paul is writing in a structure that's common for them that day that we're not using now.
No.
So it's called a chiasm. And essentially it forms like the sentence. It's hard to explain over podcast where I can't just like show you a piece of paper. But the sentences form an X-shaped pattern. So the thoughts are stated sequentially up until the main point. Mm-hmm. So you'll have like thought, kind of going up a pyramid. Then you hit the main point, and then you come back down the pyramid.
So the main point is like the cross of that.
Yeah, so it's like the middle of it. Mm-hmm. So she says that in a chiasm, the main point or highlighted idea is often at the center of a passage. So that's what's happening here. So we're going to read specifically from this. So it says, wives, submit or commit yourselves, depending on your translation, to your own husbands. To your own husbands.
Not your siblings' husbands, not your neighbor's husbands, not that guy down the street that makes you feel weird.
Thank you. As to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church. He himself is the savior of the body. But as the church submits/commits herself to Christ, so also the wives to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. So this, now we've hit the main point, and that is that he might present to himself the church in all her glory. So the he in this situation is Christ.
Christ.
Yes.
Not that guy down the street that makes you feel weird.
Nope, not that guy. Oh. All right, so now we're coming back down the pyramid. And it says, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also the church, because we are members of his body. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then she has another main point, because it does another little bloop. And it says, this mystery is great, but I am speaking concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each individual among you also love his own wife as himself, and the wife is to respect her husband. So the way that this pyramid functions, so you've got that main point in the center, but then the others line up with each other. So point 1 on the pyramid lines up with the last point on the other side of the pyramid. Point 2 lines up with the next one. Like, imagine bricks, and the ones directly across from each other line up, so they can kind of inform each other. Which, again, is a big part of why this passage is confusing.
Right.
Because it jumps back and forth from talking to wives, and then suddenly talking to husbands, and then suddenly talking about Christ and the church, and then, like, it...
Right.
It feels disorganized to us here in 2024.
Is that what year we're in?
Is it 2024?
It's unclear to me.
I'm pretty sure. So she says that when you can see the structure of the passage, you can see the points a little bit more clearly. So it, again, informs everything and helps you to understand. So first of all, Christ lowered himself down to our level. Because it says he became human, gave himself up for the church, died on the cross, all the things, right? Now, if this passage is saying to men, do as Christ did, Christ lowered himself. I just want to, like, pause on that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
These people are living in a very patriarchal society. Men have a much, much higher status than women.
Mm-hmm.
And Christ, who you're supposed to be exemplifying, lowered himself.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just put a pin in that.
Yeah.
We'll
The
come back.
God of the creation. He created you, me, that guy down the street. And brought himself down to our level in human form.
And we'll circle back to that, but I just want you to, like, you know, keep that little thought right there in your head.
And think about that in context to, I don't know, certain pastors, certain men in your life.
So she says, but even more than that, even more than lowering himself, which, I mean, yes, they were living in a very patriarchal society and men had a higher status, but the chasm between men and women is a lot less than the chasm between Christ and us. So remember that Christ lowered himself a whole bunch more. But beyond that, she says that more than lowering himself, Christ elevates the church.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, Christ came to where we are. He met us where we are. Even though he had so much more authority, so much more power, so much more, he brought himself to where we are. Mm-hmm. And then from there, he put us up on his shoulders and lifted us up as high as we could go.
Oh, I like that visual.
And he did that by sanctifying, cleansing, and glorifying the church, mm-hmm. right? So that's what Paul is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul is comparing husbands to this story right here. Now, one thing that I've heard, and this is a little bit of an offshoot, but I hear this all the time. These biblical, wonderful men will say, well, I would die for my wife. Christ died for the church.
Oh, yes, I would love to dive into this topic.
It's the dumbest argument.
I was actually thinking, this is one of my shower thoughts this morning. It is so much easier to think, like, of course I would die for you.
Mm-hmm.
That is the easy way out.
Oh, yeah.
To end it all and be done.
Mm-hmm.
It is so much harder to live for someone.
Right.
You can't care for someone. Like, for example, on a plane, put on your own oxygen mask before you put on someone else's. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder because you can't care for someone else without caring for yourself and making sure you're okay. Does that make sense?
I think we bounced to a different topic for a second there.
Oh, well, you can cut that part out. That was my shower thought.
But your point is super valid because living for someone is really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with my kids. I can tell you that I love my kids enough that if a bus is barreling down the road towards them, I'm going to shove them out of the way, even if it means I'm going to get hit by the bus. However, it's a one moment thing. Mm-hmm. It's a one moment decision, as opposed to every day when they wake me up at 7:00, not getting frustrated with them and letting them climb in my bed and climb on top of me and say, mama, 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 and living every day
mm-hmm.
with them in mind, with their best interests in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the point there, and on top of that, what a stupid thing to say. I would die for you. In what scenario are you being asked to die?
Alyssa, I would catch a grenade for you. Throw my head on a blade for you.
I don't think people are going to know that song anymore. That was from, like, high school.
It's Bruno Mars. Look it up.
Don't, though, because he's kind of the worst.
He is the worst.
But it's just, how often are you being asked to jump in front of a bullet for somebody else?
No.
You're just not.
Rarely.
And you know that.
Mm-hmm.
The husbands who are saying, well, I'm fulfilling my calling from God because I'm willing to die for my wife,
mm-hmm.
have simplified it to a level that is blasphemous. I mean, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's asking absolutely nothing of you, because you know, and I know, and your wife knows, and the creepy guy down the street knows that you're not going to be asked to die for her.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in some random 1% chance scenario,
Mm-hmm.
but 99.999999999% of the time,
Mm-hmm.
that's not happening. So stop being stupid. Don't offer to die for your wife. Live for her.
Mm-hmm.
Every day, live for her best interest.
Yeah. Wake up and think, how can I show up for this person
Yep.
more?
How can I serve her today?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for wives too. I'm not saying this specifically
Well, it
to
says
men.
submit to each other.
Exactly. It's just kind of the point that we're making here is wake up and serve one another, because Christ spent his life in humble service to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what we're supposed to compare ourselves to, if that's what we're supposed to be.
And also, offshoot, I don't mean say like, well, I did the dishes for her.
Right.
No, it's not her job.
Right.
It's both of yours job. Both of your jobs.
Be a partnership.
Yeah.
Work
A
together.
little tit for tat.
I'm going to cut that part out.
That's a quote from The Corpse Bride.
Great. So anyway, that was us just chatting.
Let's reel it back
We
in.
got a little off topic there. So what she says is that when you interpret this passage through traditional gender roles, so the expectation of like Christian conservative gender roles, the message of Christ lowering himself and elevating the church really gets lost. And I love how she says it, because she says this glorious message is lost or overshadowed. So we've heard, and we mentioned this in the last podcast, men will say things about a submissive wife and a submissive marriage like, oh, it's this beautiful picture of Christ and the church. But here, she's turning that completely on its head. And she says, here is a glorious message of Christ and the church. Christ lowering himself and elevating the church, not Christ staying at his high societally expected position and expecting the church to stay where she is.
Sizzle. Also, like, think about that. Like, he's elevating the church, making all their dreams come true, right?
Yep.
Rather than saying, like, you might have dreams, but mine are more important.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually don't get to achieve your dreams. You get to help me achieve mine.
Yep. Yeah.
Might be thinking about Harrison Butker.
So, I just think that's a beautiful point. I think we've heard that traditional stereotype so many times, and I just absolutely love how she words it.
Mm-hmm.
So, she talks through a little bit of Ephesians, and then, making the church holy and blameless, things like that. And I think we've talked through a lot of this just in our random chatting. But she says that you need to note that Paul doesn't ask husbands to give up their lives for their wives. Like, just make that little note. I know we kind of made that point a second ago, but Paul doesn't make that point either.
Right. It's something that we've just made up on our own.
Mm-hmm. Because we will say, well, Christ did give up his life for the church. Okay.
Well, it's like that toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we want to they love talking about death.
Yay, death.
That makes me more manly if I'm willing to die.
Mm-hmm. But she does talk about that. She says neither death or dying or the crucifixion or the cross are explicitly mentioned in Ephesians 5. And there are enough explicitly mentioned things that Paul would have said that if that was the point.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. He gives them actual, humble, real instructions of like, here's who Christ was. I knew him. You knew him from his writings, his teachings, his whatever. Do that. Stop being dumb. She also quotes Ephesians 5:2 So that's a little bit earlier in the passage, but it's important to read the whole passage. I would encourage you to open up Ephesians, read the whole chapter. But Ephesians 5:2, Paul tells the Ephesians to walk in love as Christ also loved us and gave himself for us, a sacrificial and fragrant offering to God.
I think that's such an important message, too, because you look at the message of wives submit to your husbands all of the time. Mm-hmm. There's very little love in that.
Love never gets mentioned.
No. It says, love your wives like Christ loved the church. But the message is more geared towards women. Like, put aside your dreams. Pick up the broom. Mm-hmm. And that's your life. And that's all you're ever going to amount to is less than.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of an offshoot. We might cut this. But I've had this conversation with many, many family members. But one of them that sometimes we agree on these things, sometimes we don't. But he had said that it's never a man's job to tell a woman what her job is, what God is telling her to do. Mm-hmm. And I find that so interesting because it's always, not always, but often male pastors getting up and talking about submission and telling a wife what she is supposed to be doing.
Right.
Pointing out the speck in someone else's eye instead of looking at their own. You're supposed to submit. You're supposed to do this. And not saying like, hey, let's just keep to ourselves and whatever God tells me to do, I'll do. And whatever God tells you to do, you should do.
Because I believe that I have a relationship with God and you have a relationship with God. And I respect both of our relationships separately.
And that they can be different.
Yeah.
That my reality isn't everybody's reality.
And we say that all the time. That's so important to remember.
I feel like I say that 4 times an episode.
Get it tattooed on ourselves.
Yes. That wouldn't be weird at all. But one of the really important, so she makes a footnote on this and we can circle back later. But she says an important note is that husbands cannot cleanse or sanctify their wives.
I love that.
That's the
Say
work
it again
of
for the
Jesus.
people in the back.
So I'm just going to read this directly. I just love it. Note also that husbands cannot cleanse or sanctify their Christian wives. That's the work of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Husbands are not Jesus. If you guys could, I'm like gesturing with my hands.
Which I think so often in the conservative world, men forget that.
Oh, yeah.
They would never say it, but they forget it.
Yeah. But some of them do say it. So she posts a video on this article, and I will do my best to link this article. But she posts a video where this man directly says that the husband's role is to sanctify his bride and make her presentable before Christ.
You cannot.
If that's right, and she makes this point, if that's right, if that's really true, what about single women?
Yeah. What does that mean for me?
You can't be sanctified. You are screwed. Better find a man.
I'm going down.
And what does it mean about widowed women?
Yeah.
What does it mean about women who marry non-Christ follower men?
Because we've had examples of that in our lives.
Absolutely. Or what about men who seemed like they were following God and then didn't? She says that the Bible teaches that Jesus is the Savior and Sanctifier of both men and women. And I mean, you can see that throughout the whole Bible.
World.
Yeah.
Jesus is the Savior of the world. Not that creepy guy down the street.
No. Or the creepy guy you married, if you married a creepy guy. Or the nice guy that you married.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
And frankly, let's flip it on its head a little bit. Do you want that responsibility? I think we brought up this point in the last podcast too. Men, do you want that responsibility of sanctifying your wife for Christ? Because I can tell you the only way that happened for humanity was Jesus coming down, getting off his throne or your high horse.
Completely blameless. Sinless.
Yep. Living a full, entire life in service to his people with 0 other priorities. No other work. no spouse, no kids, no other priorities, and then dying for it.
Mm-hmm.
Say your thought.
Why is it okay for Jesus to be single but not me?
Well, the church, you're a girl. I don't know. I got nothing for you. That's a different podcast, Brianna.
That is one that we should do.
Yes, it is. Well, we wanted to do single women in the church. So this footnote, honestly, I could do a whole podcast. Yeah. I could do a whole podcast on the things in this footnote. I think, like, we really could. But one of the other points that she makes, and I just want to bring it up, it kind of is a little bit of a different thought. She says that the idea that the husband is the final decision maker has no biblical basis.
Tell me more, Alyssa.
I would love to, Brianna. Thank you for asking.
You're welcome.
She says the only biblical precedent that she can find is in 1 Corinthians 7:5. So let's look that up real quick. She links to it. And I just want to point out the difference between this article and the article that we read from on the last podcast. The amount of references.
And research.
So much. There's so many different biblical passages here. She's got so much research. I mean, this woman, this is a research essay. Like, if she turned this in, she'd get an A.
Yeah, it's not just like, here's a verse, but this is what I got from this verse. No, it's like, here's the biblical, like, research and history behind this verse.
Exactly. And the other article just, it just didn't have any of it. He would reference an occasional verse, and I think we talked about the verses that he did reference, but it was mostly specifically from this passage in Ephesians. And
it's all just his thoughts about it.
Yeah.
This is what I interpreted, and this is what I think.
Which, again, if this works in your life, like, I guess, have a great time if your wife is chill with it, but don't put it on an entire gender.
No.
And certainly don't put it on an entire gender and then say it was God's idea. Because that's a recipe for abuse. Cough, 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 cough. So,
do you need a Kleenex?
Yeah.
That's what people need for coughs, right?
They need Kleenexes. So she says the only reference that she can find for that is 1 Corinthians 7:5, and I'm going to read that for you. It says, "Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again. Otherwise, Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So I'm pretty sure this was talking about sex.
Oh, baby.
I actually want to look this up, though, in, like, the NLT.
I actually love what that says, though, like, because just for me personally, like, being in small groups with women who were married, they would say, well, if we get into an argument and we can't come to a decision, submission to me means that my husband gets just the final say. Rather than stopping that argument right there and both praying about it.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. And assuming that God is not the God of confusion and that you both have good relationships with him and that he will lead you to the same conclusion.
Right.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, thank you. I thought about that.
It is about sex. This verse. The NLT says, "Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer." But the reason that she references that verse in particular is that it's talking about husbands and wives making a mutual decision together. So whatever it's about, it's not necessarily... I mean, it is specifically talking about that, but...
Another big S.
But coming together and making a decision together. However, make a note, it says together. Not... And husbands, tell your wives they're going to do this.
Which, again, could lead to abuse.
Literally is abuse. Yeah. So, that's kind of a little bit of that footnote. And that's a good one to go into. I really like it. Okay. So, going back to that chiastic structure that we talked about earlier.
Full circle.
Full circle. Are you proud?
No.
Oh, you should probably be. I'm actually offended. So that means that, and it's hard to explain without like having a visual. If we had an actual like YouTube video, I'd pop up a slide.
Oh, like a real professor.
Yeah.
Was it prostitute?
Yes. They love slides. Anyway, you can tell when we're being foolish. It always gets loud. So she letters the sections so that you can kind of see them ascending and descending, so that you can see which verses are kind of matched up in that chiastic structure. So she says that Paul links submission with respect in those, the first, like the A, she calls them the A sentences. So that's those first kind of pillar blocks there. So then that means that submission and respect are connected. Now, she points out that the word for submit is not always in all of the ancient manuscripts that contain Ephesians 5:22.
Tell me more, Alyssa.
That's really all.
Oh.
I know a whole lot about that. But it's just an interesting point that, again, it calls translators into question because they're pulling from all kinds of ancient manuscripts.
But also you think, like, the different translations are all, like, they all have there's an agenda.
They're skewed a little differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you think KJV,
Mm-hmm.
ESV,
They have an agenda to some degree. And you can look that up and actually prove that. So the King James Version was written because King James needed a Bible that held up the monarch. Just knowing this from history classes and my Bible classes in college, the Bible, there was a study Bible at the time. I think it was the Geneva Bible. I'm not 100% sure.
I don't know.
That was the most popular choice at the time. And it was very down on, like,
Monarchy.
Yeah, the government, monarchy, whatever. And so he needed something that was going to religiously tell people that they had to follow him. So he had the KJV commissioned.
It's a great way to manipulate people.
Absolutely.
If
Religion
you
always has been.
Tell people that God wants this of you rather than I want this of you, you're going to get a lot more pull that way.
And then you can look at the ESV as well, which was written in response to the NIV. I believe. The NIV was written and put a lot of more gender neutral terms because they were translating it that way, because they were looking at the original manuscripts and they're saying, oh, hey, this doesn't mean a masculine term or a feminine term. It means both. So the NIV translators wrote it that way. Yeah. The ESV was written because they looked at the NIV and they said, no, absolutely not. You're taking gender out of the Bible. How dare you? And so they wrote it in a much more extreme male-based way. So you can see that happening all over the place. So that's just kind of what she's saying here is, like, in a lot of the ancient manuscripts, the word submit is not there. So it's just, that's why when she quotes it up here, she says submit/commit yourselves, because that would be the other translation.
I just really wish that in all of this, people would look at each other and say, God created you and God created me in love. So let's just love each other. Let's quit trying to put each other down, trying to argue for who's more in power. It's just really frustrating. Because I don't think that's what Jesus would want.
No, but that's even how we structure our whole churches. You've got the pastor up here, and then you've got the elders, and you've got the deacons, and then you've got the volunteers, but only these volunteers are the important volunteers, and then...
It's a show.
It is, oftentimes.
And not only, like, the leaders of the church, but even people who go to church. It's about, like, what car are you driving? What are you wearing to church? How many sports are your kids in? How many kids do you have? You know, are you single? Are you married? Are you with someone? There's just so many ways to judge people.
Well, as people, we love to be the most in power, the most influential. And unfortunately, that seeps into our churches, and we don't even I don't want to say we don't realize it. We don't want to admit to it.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is better. So, anyway. So, she says that the reason that you'll see submit in pretty much every translation, not every translation, but a lot of them, is because the translators are inferring it from the preceding verse, so 21, where Paul calls for mutual submission among all believers, meaning Christian brothers and sisters, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says that the entire household code is introduced by a call to mutual submission.
Mm-hmm.
So submit/commit yourselves to one another out of reverence to Christ.
I just want to make it clear, as a single woman, I have no problem submitting to Christ, who died for my sins, who made it heaven available to me. I do not want to replace that submission directly to God, when and if I get married, to a human man.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. And unfortunately, this is like kind of off topic too, but like I look at the different people that I've dated, and I've dated both Christian men and non-Christian men. And I got more love and respect from the non-Christian people.
How sad.
Yeah. Because the Christian men that I've dated were interested in power.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, the non-Christian guy that I dated, he just took my feelings into consideration way more than the Christian men ever have.
Well, because, I mean, you would hope, and society at large, particularly from what I've heard in online dating, can definitely be very, like, toxic masculinity stuff going on there. But at the same time, like, the not crappy guys are now being taught, hey, respect women, hey, take their feelings into account, hey, be not
Treat
a jerk.
women like humans.
Mm-hmm. But then you contrast that with men in the church who are being taught that they need to be the leader.
And dominant.
Yeah, they need to take charge. They need to make all the decisions. And if they don't, they are not following God's plan for them.
Right. Right.
Which is a lot of pressure on them too.
Mm-hmm.
And even the ones that, and, you know, we talked about people preaching this but not living it, maybe, and this is just totally me in my own head, so no research based at all, but maybe for men in that situation, the reason why they're preaching it is because if they don't, then they feel like they're not fulfilling God's plan for them.
Right. Very true.
And I think that's an important point to make too, is that we recognize that, like, men struggle with a lot of this stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, I mean, the submission one is kind of female based, but dealing with persecution within the church, dealing with manipulation within the church, and the changing of God's word and things like that, this is not specific to women.
That would actually be a great idea to have Nathan come on the podcast one time, or your husband come on the podcast.
We've said his name before.
Because I don't know what men go through. I just know what me as a woman, what I go through. But
well, and it's super important to say, I don't understand your experience. I have not been there.
Well, even like someone who was listening to our podcast, her and her husband, he was saying, I didn't know women were being taught that. I don't know what the men are being taught either.
Exactly. Well, we don't get to go to the men's conference.
Yeah. Well, we're not invited.
No.
We don't get to go golfing and shooting and
have strippers on stage, apparently.
I was going to say taxidermy. I don't know. What do men do?
So Brianna's idea of traditional man and womanhood: women embroider, men do taxidermy.
Is that not right? What? I found a book the other day at the book sale that was all about embroidery. I think that'd be a great podcast, just me reading that book.
Yeah, I think people would love that.
Traditional womanhood.
I don't think anyone's arguing that traditional womanhood means embroidery. I think that's just you.
Women love to do that.
No, they don't. No one loves to embroider. Did you ever see Pride and Prejudice? They sit there and they're like, why are we doing this?
Because women embroider. writer.
All right.
They play piano and
We're at 53 minutes and I've got more points to make.
Not bad.
So then she says in the B statements, so that next block up on either side, ascending and descending, Paul links the husband is the head of the wife with a verse from Genesis 2. So that's where it says the man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, etc. 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 And she said that a lot of people, and rightfully so, would read the word head and interpret it as a metaphorical meaning for leader or someone in authority or, you know, the person making the decision, the brains of the operation, right? But in ancient Greek, which of course is where this is coming from, the word head would rarely have meant that, would rarely have meant authority. And she has a whole article on this, and I would really love to do a whole episode on the Greek word is actually kephale, for the Greek word for head. And she talks about this metaphor, but as a very basic explanation, it means unity.
Oh.
Unity.
I've never heard it interpreted that way.
Well, it's because we don't hear about it in context.
No. And we're not taught to look into the original Greek.
Not at all.
Or the, original translations at all.
However, I would like to point out that our pastors, as a rule, who have been educated in this, have studied the ancient Greek, have studied the ancient Hebrew, and they should know this crap. And they should be able to inform you about it. The fact that the two of us are sitting here being the first ones to tell this to you is a little sad. Like, I'm really glad that we can have this time with you and that you trust us to...
You're welcome.
to talk about these things and hopefully make you laugh a little bit. But your pastors should be telling you this stuff. It shouldn't just be us. So demand better, I guess is what I'm saying.
Demand better.
So then she talks about how Paul uses the head body metaphor previously, also in Ephesians 1. Ephesians is a really interesting book. And she says that he uses it when he talks about how amazingly God has endowed the church. So the verses are Ephesians 1:18-19, and then she moves on to verse 23, and it says, "The riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people and his incomparably great power for us who believe." And then we jump to verse 23, because it says, "As his body, we the church are the fullness of him, Christ the head, who fills everything in every way." So again, we've got Christ in here. Look, he keeps bringing God in.
What?
I know.
In the Bible?
In the Bible. It's shocking.
I'm baffled.
So he's using this in his illustration to husbands and wives to yet again say, hey, look, Christ took himself from the authority that he was given, brought himself to where we are.
He is the 3-in-1. He could be himself.
That's true. To where we are, and raised the church up. So we're just essentially like making the same point, but in a different, more poetic way.
They say that if something is truly important, it's said about 3 times.
Yeah. They also say if you're going to buy something online, you have to put it in front of someone like 3 to 5 times before they'll actually click purchase.
I am telling you, those shoes have been everywhere. They are like, you need to buy these shoes on Instagram, on Facebook, in my dreams.
Because they know.
I know. They got me.
You're going to buy them.
I know.
So, one point I just do want to circle back to, and I hope that I've made this clear, but we're not saying that, like, men are so superior to women that they have to lower themselves to our level.
No.
What we're saying is that in the Roman world, in the Greek world, men had so much more authority than women. So much more power than women. Yes, there were some women that were able to break free of that, but as a whole.
Yeah. And again, we're reading this with our 2024 hats on. You got to think about this in ancient Roman or ancient Greek, whatever times.
Right. So that what's being asked of these men, of these husbands, is take that authority that you have and toss it to the side. You don't need it anymore. Because God's your authority.
Right.
Because God's her authority. Yeah.
Be different than the society that's around you.
And that gets used, you hear that a lot, arguing against Christian feminism to say, like, well, we need to be different than society, and society is so feminist. Well, yeah.
Not the society back then.
No. Paul calls us to be different than society, absolutely. But he called us to be different than his society.
Right.
That he knew.
Right.
Not the society that we're sitting in.
I think that's such an important point, and if you want to rewind it, listen to it again.
I think we've also made that point before.
We have. Hey, if something's important, you say it more than once.
So yeah, I think that this is a good stopping point. We've hit an hour at this point. You guys might be bored of us. Expect a part 3, because this is just something that we're super passionate about and that we think is really important. We've seen too many stories where women get told that this section of Ephesians means they have no authority, they have no brain of their own.
Yeah. When God gave you and I both a brain.
Yeah.
Now, I don't use mine very often.
We're just, I think this is of critical importance to the future of the church.
Yeah.
If we don't get this right, I don't know how we stand before God at the end and say, God, look what we did.
Or I don't know how I can go on to tell, like, other people, yeah, you should definitely follow this church or follow this religion.
So let's try again, guys. As a church, as a community of believers, let's take another pass at what Paul is saying and really think it through.
Right.
Really dig super deep. Not just, let's do a quick Google search and let's find the highest rated things, because let me tell you, they're bad.
They are.
But really dig in.
Really difficult to find quality research on this topic. And I'm glad that we're able to share this with people.
Yeah. So we will see you again in 2 weeks. However, we are super excited. We're going to start doing something a little bit new.
Because we need to make this a priority in our lives and in yours.
We are your priority.
You need to hear our voices more often.
We're a great time, okay, guys? So on our off week, so right now we post bi-weekly, and we would love to get to a point where we are posting full episodes weekly, but we both have jobs and
we both have lives.
Yeah. So that's just not practical for us right now. So what we are really excited to start doing is on our off weeks, we're going to do a mini episode. And we're going to try and record those more kind of in real time so that we can talk about things that are happening right now.
Hot button current events.
Absolutely.
For example, the Harrison Butker speech.
Yes.
I'm very passionate about that.
We're going to record that, but probably tonight because we got to get ready to go.
Yeah.
So that'll be a shorter episode. It's just going to be less research based and more just us chatting about what's going on in the world.
I think you guys will love it. We love to chat.
I don't know what you're talking about. We haven't been talking for an hour.
I'm a little sassy, and she's maybe sassier.
I don't think so.
I just have no filter.
You have no filter.
That's true.
We know. Mom is very upset about it.
I know.
Okay. So thank you guys so much for listening. Please follow us on our social media accounts at wearemore.podcast or we.r.more4 on TikTok. And we'll see you next week.
We love you, and good night.